as I think I mentioned yesterday, the question of early childhood in general, and violence and displacement and adversity can be understood on many levels. And all of you as reporters know that when we're reporting on child refugees, we're dealing with events that are experienced at a biological level, a psychological level, and a social level. In this session now, we're going to move from the sort of social and educational policy realm that we had in our session this morning to very much the micro level and the question of how extreme adversity affects the developing brain and what's been learned about what science can teach us about helping children in distress, helping children who've experienced horror or displacement or separation. It is a privilege and a pleasure to introduce my friend Stacy Drury here, who has worked with the DART Center before on early childhood matters. She is a MD and a PhD, so a double doctor, Dr. Drury. She's a clinician scientist focused on the lifelong effects of early childhood adversity, including child maltreatment. She is the director of the Stress Environment Research Collaborative in Health Disparities at Tulane University in New Orleans, and is the associate director of the Tulane Brain Institute. She's also the vice chair of research in the Department of Pediatrics and holds the Remigio Gonzalez, MD, Endowed Professor of Child Psychiatry. She also directs genetic and epigenetic studies of the ongoing Bucharest Early Intervention Project. I'm not going to go into huge detail about her work, partly because she's going to, I'm sure, end up talking about it, but I will tell you that she has a really diverse background. Stacy, her BA was in actually religious studies and biology from the University of Virginia, her master's in human genetics, a PhD in genetics and biometry, and an MD from Louisiana State University, and an MD from Louisiana State University as well. So to this complex and diverse, wide-ranging issue of child refugees, she brings about as much different scientific and cultural expertise as can be brought in some ways. She's going to talk to us a little bit about the neuroscience of adversity, and I would invite you both to kind of follow the science and think about what you need to know more about and ask questions as one does, and also in the back of your mind begin to think about how this might apply to what story ideas this might generate for you. We'll be brainstorming toward the end of the day. Related to that, I also wanted to say that our friends from the Bernard Family Foundation and the Jacobs Foundation and Two Lilies Foundation who are here are here not only as funders but as experts, and they too will have some insights, and they'll sort of be taking notes, and maybe at the end of the day, before we go into our small groups, may want to add some comments to questions which arise during the discussions. I think they'll have some added input, and we'll figure out a way to kind of get that in. Anyway, I'm going to get out of the way, and Stacy, you should come up here. And again, to Stacy and everyone, be mindful of the simultaneous translation. Try not to talk too fast. And otherwise, we'll take it from there.
All right. Hold on to your hats. One thing that I am going to say up front in terms of disclosures, and I think it's actually important, is I will mention the use of psychotropic medications, and I will mention it because I think it's being done poorly. So I don't have any ties with the pharmaceutical companies. They don't like me. But I think as you think about what is going on, it's really important to understand the sort of treatment that ends up happening when we don't have all of the resources that we need, and to be very mindful of that. Okay. So I do a lot of diverse work, and my educational background is the equivalent of being a mutt, which means that I trained in all these different areas because I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. At the end of the day, what I do is really, really obvious. And so if you fall asleep in the neuroscience, these are the key points. So first, ice is slippery. Second, kids are different than adults. Kids are not all the same, and I loved your question earlier about some of these kids are going to be fine. And I think that's absolutely critical. And if you could figure out what is special or unique about them or their environment and bottle it and spray it in the air, we would be very excited. But kids are not all the same, and that's critically important. Parents are important, and I use the term parents very broadly, because when I think of a parent, I think of that safe person, my go-to person when I am in an environment that is new, that is unstable, and that person could be a parent, it could be a grandparent, it could be an older sister or brother. It could also be the person that is in my preschool. It could be the person that is serving my food. It could be a nurse or an aide. So I think that's also really important. We talk about empowering, and I loved, were you in that seat before? No. You were? Okay. So whoever was talking, you were talking about the preschool within the camps. And I loved that question or that thought, because part of it is about finding who can be the safe person or the go-to person. And it may not be able to be their parents for a variety of reasons, but building the capabilities of the adults around these children to function like safe caregivers is really important. And then the last point, which I think you all get, is that trauma's bad. So if you want to go to sleep now, you can. I don't know how to talk about it. Okay. This is the outline. We're going to talk super rapid introduction to brain development, focused on what I think you need to know. We're going to talk about a dimensional thought process related to what these kids are experiencing. We'll talk about stress, neural circuits, multi-generational effects, and then everybody loves bubble wrap. And we'll talk about what that means. So brain development. So brain development is not static. It begins at conception. A huge amount of it is completed before the child leaves the womb. And different parts of the brain develop at different rates. There are certain parts of the brain that require experiences to actually form and develop effectively. And there are parts of the brain that, if they get certain experiences, will respond to manage that expected environment later. And that's going to be really important. And I think, again, goes back to your thought process about what these kids experience may be their normal environment. Experiences that are positive and negative have differential effects depending on when they occur in development. So if you are 30, certain experiences won't have as much of an effect as if you're 3. But they won't also have the same effect of having those experiences when you're 8 or 16. So understanding where the child is in the normative developmental trajectory, both in terms of social emotional development and brain development, is important, because that's the area where the greatest impact will be seen. Areas of the brain that are most rapidly developing at the time of negative and positive exposures are the ones that will be most impacted. So the age at which trauma occurs matters. It doesn't mean that there's ever a good age for trauma. So they're like, wait, is there a particular age where it's really good to have trauma? No. There is not. But the age really does matter. Group quiz number 1. So these are all brains, and what I would like people to do is to vote on the brain and what it looks like when an individual is born. Everybody has to raise their hand at some point. So let's start with, can you guys see that arrow? Yeah, good. That one. Who thinks it's this one? Who thinks it's this one? Who thinks it's this one? This one? This one? This one? Hanan, you have to answer. This one. It's this one. I know, that's what I said. I didn't do very well in neuroscience in med school. I had to learn it later. This is incredibly important. The number of neurons in an individual's brain is maximized, or the highest it will be, at age 2. So, have any of you ever had a 2-year-old child? Did they act like they knew everything and controlled everything and thought they were smarter than you? They actually had more brain cells than you did. So that's really important, okay? So, and somebody over there talked about the NGOs removing funding for maternal care. I absolutely want you to fight that. Because if this is the brain of a child that is being born, the impact that you are thinking about for the kids that have been exposed doesn't just include the kids that were born, it includes the ones that are being born. And so we have to keep that in mind as we think about this long term. So there are key steps in brain development.
I'm sorry, the last two, the other brains, for people.
Oh, this is adults? Yeah. Huh?
What are the others?
Oh, these are all different ages of prenatal development. So these are all in the first trimester, this is second trimester, this is third trimester, and this is birth. Okay. These are the main cellular processes that happen in the brain, and they occur at different times in a child's development. So neurogenesis is the birth of new cells. So the vast majority of all the cells you will have in your brain is done by age 2. Okay? So when we think about interventions that have lifelong effects on your neurocognitive or brain or thought process or social emotional processes, those cells are formed by age 2. After that, it's all downhill. So synaptogenesis is the connections between cells, and the connections that form are based on your experiences. So the more you use a particular circuit or connection of cells, the stronger it becomes. And if you don't use a particular set of circuits, those cells are pruned, just like if you were gardening. They're cut away. And once they're cut away, they don't come back. So the early experiences builds these connections and strengthens them, and then cuts away the ones we don't use. Myelination is the final process, and this is really putting the insulation or covering over the circuits that have formed to make them work better and faster. So for any of you who were teenagers, did you make really good decisions when you were an adolescent? No, you didn't. I didn't. You might have. The reason for that is that you had a lot more circuits that were kind of, dysfunctional, and you didn't have as much myelin. So in the United States, you can rent a car at the age of 25. And what they didn't know, but actually turns out to be very neuroscience-based, is that age 25 is about the time that your decision-making part of the brain is fully developed and myelinated. So they knew something a long time ago, which is you're much more likely to get into a car accident in somebody else's car if the front part of your brain, the decision-making part of your brain, isn't fully developed. So when we think about these processes and decision-making and what's happening in these children's lives, they don't have that ability to think through or make the appropriate neurocognitive decisions. And I'm very anxious about these people who are becoming parents at earlier and earlier ages, or who are being married at earlier and earlier ages, because their brains are not going to be fully developed. Their decision-making, their ability to do the toughest job in the world, which is to be a sensitive and responsive caregiver, they don't have that neurocognitive capability at age 14 or 15 or 18. So this is the structure of a neuron. It's important because these little things over here form the connections between them. They send chemical signals back and forth. These are the neurotransmitters. So these are the chargers, basically, of the neurons, and we'll talk a little bit about them. But these chemicals send signals that influence things like mood, like attention, like memory. They require the signals to go back and forth. And one of the things that's really important is a fundamental, critical factor in all of this in terms of early brain development is nutrition. So as we think about combined impacts of negative experiences, lack of exposure to typical environments, and poor nutrition, we are creating synergistic negative effects on the structure and development and function of the brain. All right. So this is actually from the National Institute of Health, from Jake Eads' lab. Oops. Come on. Where's my cursor? There we go. So I want you to watch. This is from birth all the way through age 25. And what you are seeing, I'm going to play it again, maybe, is the blue is actually myelin. So you are seeing myelin slowly cover the whole brain. So it starts very little myelin. Myelin keeps going forward over and over again, and finally covers the whole brain. Now, if you're paying attention, this is the last part to be covered in myelin. This strip in the middle is the motor cortex. The part in the front is the prefrontal cortex. That is your decision making. That is your regulation of emotion. That is your attention control. And the back part of the brain, which also developed at the same time as the motor cortex, is your amygdala, or your emotion center of the brain. So amygdala is not just fear, it's all emotions. So it's excitement, it's enthusiasm, it's positive emotions as well. Those parts develop faster and earlier, but the control mechanism doesn't develop until around age 25. This is a graph of development. Let's see if I can do it from here. Okay, so what we see is that in the early years, this is the maximal development of synapses for sensory and motor. This is receptive and expressive language. So if you're looking, these are months. So we are in the first years of life. And then your higher order cognitive function, so things like decision making, executive function, spatial working memory, long-term memory. Those are at later ages, right? So beginning with peak synaptogenesis at around 4 or 5 and continuing through mid-adolescence. So synaptogenesis happens first, and then imagine that pruning is shifted a little bit to the right and myelination shifted a little bit to the left. So when we think about the different ages at which these children are exposed, we're going to have differential impact based on the timing at which these happen. This is the way that I understand it, as opposed to the other picture. Sometimes things are better. It's kind of like me playing Jenga. I don't know if you guys know that game. All right, the building blocks of all of your higher order cognitive functions happen early. And if you build those fundamental blocks effectively, you can make a tower that is much more stable and much higher. If early on you have shifts, even if you were able to push these back, you will have deviated trajectories. You will have less abilities to potentially develop the higher order executive functions that we think are so important, or the higher motor or the higher social emotional functioning that you need. So this is your argument. So if you want to play Jenga, or you want to ask policymakers or government officials to think about early childhood brain development, ask them to build a tower as high as they can, and then shift the lower blocks for them and see how high they can make that tower. It's actually part of our early childhood testing, neurocognitive skills. But say if you want your population to reach their maximal ability, you have to shift these earlier blocks and make sure that they are well developed, or you won't have the fundamental neurocognitive capacity that you need to be successful. So, and I'm going to give you these slides as a PDF. So prenatally, most of neurogenesis is complete. At birth, there are these very short connections in the brain, all right? And what we really want are long connections that allow you to integrate lots of information. Overall myelination peaks. Preschool is an incredibly important period of strengthening the connections between our brain cells that are important. So if I am in a refugee camp and not being exposed to any stimulation, I'm not forming any connections, and I'm certainly not strengthening the ones that I need. Apoptosis and pruning occur throughout, and it's not until the mid-20s when the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. This is another way to explain this to people who haven't spent a lot of time being nerds in the neuroscience world, which is the ability of the brain to adapt to changes varies over the course of development. So the amount of effort that you need, or new exposures or positive experiences to shift brain development, goes down as you get older. So for all of us, especially me, because I'm getting really old, it's incredibly hard to learn new things, to change my behavior patterns. Just ask my kids, because there's a lot of effort. So creating new neural circuits is incredibly hard as we get older. So the earlier we get in, the more powerful our low-intensity interventions will be. So have you guys ever seen the show Mythbusters? Okay, good. We're going to have a lot of these because I think these are really important, and we were talking about things that are wrong in the literature. It's actually usually things that are wrong in this MD world, so I can make fun of MDs because I am one. There is no age at which you are too young to remember an event. It did not affect her. So I live in New Orleans, and the Saints lost yesterday, so that was hard, a little traumatic. But I also lived in New Orleans for Katrina, and we still have lots of negative consequences of that. But what I heard from a variety of different families was, I would ask, did anything traumatic happen to your child? And they would say no, she was only 1 or 2. Well, where was she? She was in the Superdome. There were dead bodies all around her, but she doesn't remember it. So then my next question is, how does she do with storms? Oh, she's terrified. She crawls under the bed. She was 6. So 4 years after the event without any intervention because mom said she was too young. So there is no too young for when trauma can have an effect. Now, whether she could give me a narrative story or whether it came out in repetitive traumatic play is different. But there isn't an age at which the impact doesn't matter, because it turns out my other key point, parents are important, is none of these individuals have parents who didn't have this experience or some sort of experience. And so the impact is going to be compounded. Okay. So we're going to go into this dimensional approach because I was struck when I was reading some of the background material for you guys that there's a lot of focus on trauma. And I really want to shift your thinking a little bit in terms of neurodevelopment to a more dimensional a more broad scale understanding of what these kids are experiencing. And so this is a paper that I'll make sure you get from Margaret Sheridan and Kate McLaughlin, who are great, and I work with a lot, that talked about negative exposures in terms of a combination of deprivation and threat. So our brain doesn't respond to deprivation the same way that it responds to threat, right? So the circuits that control my response to things that scare me are different than the circuits that are required for language. So what we have, and we'll talk about data from institutionalization, which is something we think of as high deprivation but relatively low threat. For the kids that are exposed to war, you're looking out here. So we're going to talk about the circuits that are impacted by both deprivation and threat, because brain development thinks of those things very differently. And if we only think about this, we're going to miss a lot of this up here, which is why things like your early educational, even reading to these kids, interactions, communication, physical contact, playing with whatever toys you can find, those are going to help address this part. So it's not a separate condition that we need to think about, because if we only focus on the threat, we're going to miss the other pieces of brain development that these kids are going to be missing as well. Okay. I put this up here because, again, I think what is happening to these children is broader than just trauma. And don't get me wrong, trauma is bad, because that was key point number 4, right? But we also need to remember that the absence of positive buffers is important. Diet and nutrition is incredibly important. Exercise, so motor development is dependent on movement. And if we don't move, or we don't play, we don't learn. I don't know much about this in terms of exposures, but I do know that there was chemical warfare. I'm not sure what's happening in the camps, but if we have high lead content or we have other environmental toxins, so these are things that we should be able to at least be aware of, but together influence physiologic health and development. And the other part that I put up here that's really important is that we're not just talking about brain development, we're talking about overall physical health. So we're talking about the immune system, we're talking about the metabolic system. All of these things are regulated and controlled in the brain, but when we think about the impact, we can't separate these systems out.
Stacy, just could you define buffers? I think I may not be clear.
Buffers are good things. So buffers are things like having a positive moment. And I have this idea of kids in the little school that's within the refugee camp having a routine that they would have had in their own school if they were at home. And when they're moved to the next refugee camp, that they can still have that same routine. Parents are great buffers. Communities, so being able to be with someone that looks like you or communicates in your language are buffers. Green spaces are a huge missing buffer for Louisiana. But this idea that even having a place that is safe to play can be very powerful. And remember, the earlier or younger I am, the more impactful these pieces can be. Is that better? All right.
I have a really quick question. So we talk about buffers and how necessary they are, but is it better to have buffers even in a short amount of time and then lose that buffer than to not have buffers at all? Like, are buffers like accumulating good things?
So no one's ever actually analyzed that scientifically, but I will tell you, I think any buffer is good. And reminding the child of having that buffer and that you can find that buffer again is good. And the idea that you have to be perfectly protected all the time is not realistic, right? So are any of you parents? Okay. Did you ever have a moment when you weren't perfectly attuned to your child. Never, right? I mean, okay, I have them regularly. I have a teenage daughter, so we're not attuned. But this idea that you have to be a perfect caregiver or perfectly protective is unrealistic in the best of circumstances. So Dan Stern talked about the good enough mother, and this idea that these small moments, and I wish I could qualify them or quantify them, but these small moments still activate those circuits. And if there's 17 small moments in one day from different people, this child may still develop that circuit that says somewhere there are people that help me feel safe. And I might have to look harder to find them, but we want them to think that way. So I would love data on that. So for those of you like getting research on these would be really awesome. Okay, so we're gonna talk about stress and how we measure stress. Okay, I'm gonna wait for you to read this. And so one of the things is that it's really difficult to define adversity and stress, and that's because it comes with lots of pieces. So first of all, we have exposures, and then we have perceptions, and then we have the physiologic embodiment of stress, right? So the way I describe this to most people, has anybody here ever jumped out of an airplane on purpose? Why?
I'm really afraid of heights, and I thought it would get rid of that fear.
Okay, were you stressed?
Yeah, yeah.
Still stressed?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I popped some muscles in my neck and everything. It wasn't a good idea.
Great. Is there anyone that jumped out of an airplane and and had fun? Yeah, okay. I don't know why. So airplanes are designed to go up in the air, right? And they have a pilot, and then they're designed to come down, and you're supposed to stay in them. Remember. Yeah, still stay in the airplane. Okay. Nothing more terrifying to me. Like thinking about it, it's kind of like you, like, right? So my heart rate has gone up. I can shake really well now. You chose to do that. Okay. And my expectation is that a lot more 8-year-olds would jump out of an airplane for no good reason than grown-ups, right? So there is a perception of whether or not something is dangerous. And this goes to your point. If a child thinks that they are in a safe place, even if it's not, that's still helpful, right? And we still have a physiologic response to stress, right? So we have a physiologic thing that happens within our body. We actually have lots of them. And so when we think about adversity or stress, it's incredibly important to think about what that exposure is, because some exposures are stressful regardless, and some are not. And so there's also this perception that we need to integrate, and a physiology, and the developmental context at which we have that. So these are the beginning components of what I think of when I think about the physiologic or embodiment of stress. All right, so we have the autonomic nervous system. So what does the autonomic nervous system does? That's what makes your heart rate go up. That's what is currently making my mouth really dry, so I keep having water. When I start a talk, I'll be shaking for about 4 or 5 minutes. That's an autonomic nervous system response, all right? It's an immediate response. Turns out that early caregiving is an incredibly potent regulator of the autonomic response in children. Moms and babies, because we don't study dads enough, I apologize for that. Moms and babies actually physiologically sync their autonomic nervous systems together, beginning in utero and extending across early childhood. So babies will kick mom and increase her heart rate in utero. But this ability to have an activated autonomic response and then regulate it is incredibly important, because we want to be able to pay attention to the environment. The second physiologic system that you've probably heard the most about is the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Access. Okay? You've heard too much about it. Okay, good. I'm going to kick in my autonomic. All right. So this Hpa Axis is a later activated stress response system. So about 15 minutes after your initial stress exposure, you will increase your cortisol. So how do we do this in testing? We do this. Social evaluative threat is the best way to activate. In about 15 minutes, you're going to be really, really wide awake.
Just say, I'm your editor and you're over deadline.
Oh,
That staring thing will work.
I know. You guys probably are stared at by a lot of people, so you probably have a little bit better response. Med students hate that, just to be clear. So the second system that's activated is the Hpa Axis, all right? So this is after you have a little bit of autonomic activation. It causes an increase in cortisol, and that allows you to assess the environment, to make a decision about what's happening, and to respond. And then about 40 minutes after, your cortisol drops down. So have any of you ever taken a test? Have any of you wanted to take a nap after you took your test? That's because your cortisol goes up in the middle of that test and stays as high as it needs to. Once you turn that paper in, you're like, oof, your cortisol goes down. Okay, there is both a activation pattern that happens with stressors, and then there's a diurnal pattern. Okay? The third stress response system is the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Access. Testosterone is in everybody, and testosterone is a stress response hormone. The menstrual cycle and the development of puberty and pubertal tempo are also stress response systems. So what we see in early adversity is a shift in pubertal development that differs by sex. Boys are entering puberty faster and earlier, and girls are leaving a little bit longer gaps. Why do I say this? Because we have to think about the physiologic development of these individuals and the disconnect between the stress response systems. We'll talk a little bit about my favorite stress response system, which is at the cellular level. We'll talk about mitochondria and telomeres, mostly because they're easy to study and policymakers think they're more important than I thought they should. But I also want to highlight the immune system as another critical stress response system. So have any of you gotten sick during taking a period of exams? Yeah, of course, right? So that's because your immune system is a stress response system. And you activate cortisol, right? And that shuts down your immune system. And then your immune system's like, what? Now I got to do something, all right? So this idea that these systems are all responding to changes in the environment or whatever you want to call adversity or stress, and that it really is the balance of the systems or the ability to regulate them that is critical for healthy development. Which leads me to myth buster number 2. If I get nothing else in the literature moving forward, cortisol is not the stress hormone. It is one component of one stress response system. It is neither good nor bad. All stress is bad and too much cortisol kills your brain cells. Okay, this is not true. This is a myth. If I take hippocampal, to the memory part of your brain cells, and I put them in a petri dish, and I soak them in super high doses of cortisol for a long period of time, it will kill them. But that is absolutely not what is happening in brain development. Okay? So too much cortisol is not good or bad. You need cortisol for learning. You need cortisol to understand the environment around you. And we have data that suggests that people's cortisol is dysregulated. I don't know what dysregulated means, because it's a word that says, I'm not quite sure what happened, so I'm going to just say you're dysregulated. We have changes in the diurnal pattern, right? So we're supposed to have an early peak of cortisol so that you can pay attention, and then so you can go to sleep at night, it's supposed to drop down. Now, if I live in a place where there's constant shelling at night or there's domestic violence in my house, my cortisol's not going to have that drop. And that drop is actually really important for things like metabolic regulation, for how important your sleep is, for how well your brain recovers, right? people who are exposed to trauma, except for you really didn't budge, did you? Yeah. Okay. Except for him. Trauma exposure. Just kidding. Okay. What happens can be one of two things when I do that stress with them. So one is that they go up super high and they never come down. And that's kind of what you hear in the literature. But I will also tell you that there are people who don't raise a cortisol response at all. So I will do this social evaluative threat on children that are high exposed in New Orleans to violence, and they have no response, which is equally bad, but not because I'm killing hippocampal brain cells. It's because they can't activate this incredibly important response system to their environment, so they can't ever pay attention to things or learn things in the same way. So a little stress is a good thing, and actually managing stress or having moments when you do well with it is important. You guys are reporters, so good Lord. If all stress were bad, you wouldn't be here, I promise. No stress? Okay, you're just flattened. But it does allow you to be open and responsive. It's important for learning and for performance, and it drives development. So I put it at the bottom, this is not a myth, this is actually true. Okay, so I'm a psychiatrist, I hate diagnoses. So I don't ever use things like PTSD or depression or anxiety, in part because I've never seen a child that just had PTSD. So the children that we are treating don't just have PTSD, to be clear, and not all of them have PTSD. So we're going to talk about the neural pathways that are involved so that you can think about this more importantly. All right, so this is the video. And this is why I love journalists. Well, this is one of many reasons. Can you turn the volume on? Thank you. So I say that, or I put that up there, because I think you guys are really important. Except I can't get back to this. And that was part of a series done in New Orleans on the children of Central City. And having gone and talked to politicians for a long time and had no impact, this led to actually creating policy that all of our schools in New Orleans now need to be transformed to being trauma-informed. And I've done a lot of research on violence for a decade and never had an impact. And so this is something that shifted New Orleans, and we're really stubborn in New Orleans. So, okay, so PTSD, we talk about all these things, but I put these other symptoms up there because I think this is what you can see, and you don't have to have PTSD. You guys were talking about what you see in these children: lack of interest in things, irritability, aggression, exaggerated startle, or really no emotions at all. So those are symptoms of PTSD, but they're also things that kids that are trauma exposed will demonstrate. And difficulty concentrating. So this is the Energizer Bunny. And it turns out that if you do not use evidence-based treatments, at least PTSD does not go away. You're not going to grow out of it. All right? So if you have a child, and PTSD is the only diagnosis, I believe, at this point, that has PTSD, and you don't provide evidence-based treatment, it will not go away. So we have data going out 3, 5, 7 years. Once you get past that 6 months, when we see some people recover, it will not go away. And it won't go away with non-specific treatment either. The only challenge we have is that in order to treat PTSD, you have to actually have a safe place. So this is really important. Attention, impulsivity, and oppositional behavior problems in children are ADHD and should be treated with medication. This is a myth, okay? And for those of you who have dealt with the US system, I have removed the diagnosis of ADHD from like 90% of the kids that I see. Treating trauma with stimulant medication isn't going to work because the impulsivity or the inattention is not a function of low dopamine in the striatum. It's a function of either trauma memories constantly in these kids' head or lack of cortisol, none of which is going to respond to stimulants. There are medications that we do think help for certain symptoms, like nightmares, but this is not ADHD. There's no acute onset of ADHD after Katrina or being exposed to a bombing. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that has to have symptoms early on, usually has a strong family history. It can co-occur with trauma-exposed kids. But oppositional behavior, impulsivity, aggression, they're different than ADHD. Attention problems are not ADHD. They can be sleep problems. So if any of you not slept, is it hard to pay attention after a 40-hour travel day? Not if your cortisol's up, right? Okay. Family stress. Anxiety will make you look inattentive. Learning disabilities. So I didn't hear anybody talking about actually doing baseline assessments of these kids to see where they are. But kids have learning disabilities, and trauma-exposed kids might have them anyway. Hearing tests are actually really great to do too. PTSD, interpersonal violence. So if mom and dad are fighting all night, I'm not going to sleep, but I'm also going to be scared. So all of these things can cause attention problems. And then I think another thing that's very important in terms of what we're looking at in the Syrian refugee is hunger. Which is why I'm glad I'm giving the talk right before lunch. Wait, okay. So we're going to talk about attention another way, which is attention bias to threat. This is what I do with police officers. So one of the things that can happen when you are exposed to trauma is that your ability to understand and perceive threat changes. So when we think about threat, or we see a scary face, oftentimes we orient to it because we have to assess whether or not it's safe. And kids who are trauma exposed can do one of two things. They can either never orient to areas of threat, so they avoid things, or they can get stuck. And so what this looks like for police officers, or I imagine for soldiers, is that if you go up to a child who is trauma exposed and you say something in a loud voice, they will think you are threatening. And if they have a bias toward threat, they will not be able to understand that you're not threatening, nor will they be able to take their stare away. So they will be oriented and look like they're staring you down, or they'll freeze, but it's because their brain has trained them to be biased toward threat. Or it can go the other way, right? So they can be unable to look at something at all, so they'll avoid or look disrespectful, is how police officers describe it. So you're either a stubborn kid who's not listening to authority, or you're disrespectful and don't care, and in either case, at least NOPD, so the New Orleans police, don't respond well. But it's very important to understand that that's the neurobiology changing your perception of threatening experiences. And this is what happens, I think, and probably speaks to what you were talking about, is that sometimes we have things that should be scary, right? But if I've been doing this for a long time, this isn't so scary until the shark tries to eat my camera. So that was definitely got eaten. And so this shark wrangler had been doing this for a long time, and then the shark went after him. He got a little scared, but he kept being a shark wrangler. And after a while, if you've been swimming with sharks for so long, you just don't respond. And so this idea that you have to have a certain response to something scary or to a traumatic experience isn't accurate, because your body's going to adapt and adjust. It doesn't mean that swimming with sharks is a great idea. It just means that what you say or think or respond or tell people is going on with you may not be the same. So this plays out when I go to the emergency room for a kid who threatened to blow up his school, and I send in the student doctor first, and the student doctor says, "Has anything scary ever happened to you?" And the kid says, "No." And I go in and I say, "When was the last time you saw somebody shot or killed?" And he says, "Yesterday. My uncle got shot on my doorstep." Does he think it's scary? No. Did he tell my student doctor? No. Is it a good thing? Absolutely not. But what you will hear or how they will respond will not match their experiences with repeated exposure. So, mythbuster number 5, just because kids say they're not scared doesn't mean that their body isn't processing, physiologically responding. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project, which hopefully you guys have heard about, is a randomized controlled trial. This is going to really go into this idea of deprivation. So this was set up to look at the changing caregiving environment from an orphanage care with regimented, very little direct contact to sort of the ideal foster care. It's not the foster care in Louisiana, so we had 87% placement stability. The foster care parents in Romania were paid a salary and had a warm line to an infant mental health specialist focused on the development of attachment. And I'm not going to go through too much about it in terms of ethics. This was actually Charlie, Zena, Chuck Nelson, and Nathan Fox were invited in by the Romanian government because they didn't know what to do with all of the orphans after Ceausescu. And so there was this idea of really demonstrating positive effects. So we see increases in cortical white matter with changing the caregiving environment. So that cortical white matter is that myelin. So global increases in the ability to effectively process information. We actually saw changes in the ability to express positive emotions, which I really think is important. So this is the kids that these are the kids that were in the institution, that were randomized to stay in the institution, and these are the foster care kids. And what I want you to notice is that the ability to even express positive emotions, to smile, to be happy, to play with bubbles and think they're cool. So how many people wouldn't see you're smiling just thinking about bubbles, right? So everybody loves bubbles. But so the ability to actually express positive emotions was influenced by providing a safe caregiver. And in this case, we had a greater impact the earlier that we placed the children. So earlier is always better. I put this one in here because when you're exposed, this is actually a maltreatment study, so exposed to child physical maltreatment. What is important about this is that you lose the ability to discriminate facial expressions, or you can have an impact on this. And so what I want you to see is that this is a morphing experiment. So we put a face up here, and we slowly provide more and more information about the actual face, and we can control whether it's an angry face, whether it's a happy face, whether it's a neutral face. And what we see for abused children is that they required more information or a more bright, happy facial expression to identify that emotion. And we saw the exact inverse with anger. So children will need more input from a safe caregiver to be able to identify that you are happy with them. And they will pick up anger with less cue. And this is from anybody, right? So when we think about what we want from our providers within these environments, is that if you're tired or you're frustrated or you're just a little cranky because somebody somewhere else is doing something negative, children that are exposed to violence in particular are going to interpret that as anger at them much easier. And more importantly, their ability to identify that you are happy with them is going to require you to be like super bright, you know, like really happy, or they won't see it. So all oppositional and aggressive behavior is because kids are stubborn. Fear is a great way to trigger aggression. Okay? Distress, hunger, all of those things can cause aggression. And it is not because kids are bad. Okay? So arousal, so we talked about this, you guys have all heard this. Your brain detects a cue, it sends a signal to your pituitary sends a signal down to your kidneys, and they release cortisol, all right? There's a negative feedback loop, but cortisol is an arousal hormone. So my hands are not shaking anymore, I'm good for another 45 minutes, and then I'm gonna take a nap, because my cortisol is gonna be high, all right? I am able to look around the room and see who's texting, see who's paying attention, pay attention to who's getting sleepy, try to target my conversations to those that aren't paying attention, right? Because I'm really super focused and open to the environment. Fight or flight hormone, attention and awareness environment, it is critical to learning. It is designed to alert you to changing environments. We talked about my social evaluative stress, which you didn't feel. It can be on or alternatively never rise, all right? Autonomic nervous system, so we can have an acute Hpa response over here. This is the diurnal variation. And we also have an acute increase in our heart rate, right? So these are all different ways in which the science measures, and this is why I put this up here, is for you to understand that you want to pay attention to the literature that says that I'm targeting the acute stress response, or I'm paying attention to shifts in the diurnal. If you say that this kid has too much cortisol, it's not accurate, unless they have like an adrenal problem, okay? So be focused and thoughtful about changes in the child's ability to create an effective stress response or to regulate their physiologic stress response, or that their diurnal pattern of cortisol is shifted so the recovery that they need in terms of brain growth, development, memory, and metabolic functioning is not happening at night because their sleep is disrupted, or there's a disconnect between their metabolism and their cortisol system.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go back to what do HPA and ANS do?
That's a good point. No, that's perfect. HPA is the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Access. And no, that's good, right? And ANS is the autonomic nervous system, so that's your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system smushed together. Uh-huh. So this is the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Access. That's this one. That's cortisol. It's the whole process from the brain all the way to the kidney. That's what that refers to. And then the autonomic nervous system, right here, is your sympathetic nervous system. So that's what controls your heart rate, pupillary dilation. It's the first part of your fight or flight response. Fight or flight. And
There will not be a quiz after this?
like flight, flight.
how you would feel if a lion came in the room.
Run away.
Run away. And so it actually, like, it's what increases your heart rate. No, the adrenaline is actually different than both of these systems. So that's cortisol is sometimes called, but that's not true. So there are lots of different stress response systems, and that's one of the reasons that I want to have this up here. And they work together and in conjugation, and sometimes.
So the main thing to know is that there are several different stress response systems. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to show you this because this is the impact of that acute regulation of cortisol as a function of changing the early caregiving environment in the Romanian study. So we randomized kids. So never institutionalized kids are our control kids. And what you see is this is their baseline cortisol. The TSST, or the Trier social stressor, is what I tried to do with you and failed. But typically, it sends up your cortisol, and then over a period of 40 minutes, we see a cortisol decline. So this is the expected pattern. What we see with our children that remained in the institution is that it's flat. They didn't generate a response. And our foster care kids generated a little bit of response, but it wasn't the same. So what we see, so that's what's happening, okay? So changing the early caregiving environment corrected this very important component of one of the stress response systems.
Going back to the link between your adrenals and cortisol, how tightly are they linked? Like if you're drinking a lot of coffee and your adrenals are shot, what's happening to your cortisol?
So your adrenal glands produce cortisol, and so you can wear it out. You can wear the system out, but that's different than adrenaline.
Let me suggest if you have detailed scientific questions, hold them just a bit because I want to make sure we get to Q&A.
Okay. All right. Briefly, and again, this I don't want you guys to really get too absorbed in. Emotion regulation is a back and forth between your sensory system and your amygdala. And there's what we call a low road and a high road. And the high road is the frontal cortex, right? And so when you're little and you're 2 and you have a temper tantrum, that's because you just go straight from I want the cookie to I'm going to get the cookie. Right? As you develop your frontal cortex, you're going to be like, all right, how do I get the cookie and not get caught? Right? But if I don't have this cortex, I'm just going to go for the cookie. All right? And what we see, and again, I don't want you to get caught in the weeds of the science here, is that this connection between the amygdala and the front part of the brain actually shifts in children that were exposed to institutional care. And this is basically your typical development that between 18 and 22, at this point, you have the prefrontal cortex has a lot more control over the amygdala, so the connectivity is stronger. But this takes time. And why is this time so important? Because I want to make sure that my control is appropriate. I want to have lots of experiences and figure out when to regulate my emotion, when to do something, and when not to do that. And what we see with kids that are exposed to extreme deprivation this is your comparison kids. So early on, they're very amygdala driven, right? They want lots of things. They want to experience lots of things, right? And ideally, they have caregivers that regulate them from eating cookies all the time. And then when they get to adolescence, they start to have a little bit more prefrontal control. These are post-institutionalized children, so children that were exposed to an orphanage. And what you see is that they're shifted a lot earlier. So you would think, oh, well, that's got to be good, right? Except they never developed a wide range of thought processes or patterns or connectivity. We shifted them to having more frontal control, but they don't have an understanding of what is good or bad. So whatever pattern they had for choosing how to get the cookies is now stuck. So they lose the range of different approaches. And so the way I describe this is if they just jump on the counter to get the cookies, they're always going to jump on the counter. They're not going to learn how to build, like get a ladder or like be creative about getting the cookie or replace the cookie with plastic cookies. They're going to lose that because this circuitry controlling the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex developed too quickly. So I saw in your thing adverse childhood experiences. I'm hoping you guys watch movies. Does anyone know who this is? Yes, it's Gizmo, right? Steven Spielberg's a genius because I'm pretty sure that Yoda was a gremlin when he was little. So why would I show this? Yoda's 900 years old, right? Had a good life, a little bit of trouble. But this is what aging looks like, right? So you lose your hair, your ears actually do get bigger, wrinkles, lose facial tone. You have a good hair and cover, right? But if you expose children, you feed them after midnight, or you give them a negative environment, this is what happens to a gremlin, right? This is accelerated aging. So the adverse childhood experiences study all of those conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, depression, substance use, obesity, are disorders of aging. Adversity early on accelerates aging across all of your body systems. And it's also linked, and this is why the maternal health part is so important. It is a primary driver of preterm birth, low birth weight, and perinatal complications. So we need to integrate a multi-generational approach to what we are looking at, because the women who have been exposed to this are going to be at a much greater risk of having perinatal complications, and low birth weight and preterm birth are huge drivers of healthcare expenditure and neurocognitive and neurodevelopmental delay.
Stacey, I just want to make sure we have time for questions.
Okay.
So we should move toward 4 hours.
Okay, so we measure it by these little micro things called telomeres. Telomeres are responsive to all of these early adversity. I'm skipping through this super fast, I apologize. This is really important. So this is New Orleans. This is a study we did of a bunch of kids in New Orleans. This is the Mississippi River, so why we're called the Crescent City. These kids were not recruited for violence exposure. They were recruited for a dental study. And we looked at the effect of neighborhood violence on these children's cortisol, on their aggressive or externalizing behavior, and then on these little tiny caps at the end of everybody's chromosomes called telomeres that are aging markers. And what we found was neighborhood domestic violence in a 1 mile radius around the house of this child, and neighborhood violent crime around that child predicted telomere length, so accelerated cellular aging. It predicted externalizing or aggressive behaviors, and it predicted cortisol. So it changed behavior. It changed one of the physiologic stress response systems, and it changed a cellular marker of aging that is predictive of all of those ACE disorders, and those pathways were independent. Meaning that if I only provide mental health care, it is very likely that I'm missing the effect on cellular aging and on physiologic responses. So we have to take a more comprehensive approach. We then looked at this in a study of 400 babies. We see the same thing for mom's neighborhood during pregnancy. So mom's neighborhood level violence, controlling for everything else, impacted her child's cortisol through 1 year and her child's cellular aging at the level of the telomeres. We're going to skip this because you don't want to hear it. This is actually really important in terms of science, which is that we were able to do a study in rhesus macaques where we did a randomized caregiving swap between animals that maltreated their babies and animals that didn't. There are 3 really important things about this study. The first is every animal was randomized, so you would either have a maltreating mom or a non-maltreating mom, and you could have come from someone who was maltreating or not. The maltreatment in the rhesus macaque model is up to 6 months of age, which is the equivalent of 2 years of age in human development. And the impact that we see on cellular aging, on cortisol, and that amygdala prefrontal cortex development happened because of the early caregiving, and there was no confounding of nutrition, education. These monkeys were not doing crack or having substance use. We took away all of those confounders that we see in human studies, and we saw an effect of accelerated cellular aging, and that accelerated cellular aging not only predicted higher overall cortisol in these animals measured by hair, it also predicted that shift in amygdala prefrontal cortex coupling. So even if we take away the nutrition problem, the education problem, and the exposure after age 2, we still see an impact. So it is so important to get in there early. Okay. We see transgenerational effects of mom's adversity on baby. So this is showing shortened telomeres in the babies, changes to their autonomic nervous system in the babies as a function of mom's exposures to ACEs prior to the age of 18, controlling for her prenatal exposure. So when I talk about intergenerational risk, it's not even if the mom is okay during pregnancy. We still need to pay attention. I want to end on a positive note, which is, can parents be a biologic bubble wrap? Right? So similar to bubbles, everybody likes bubble wrap. But bubble wrap is designed to protect you from exposures around you, right? So between the ages of 7 and 9 months, we have this wonderful relationship that develops. This is why your nieces and nephews won't come to you anymore once they reach about 9. It's because an individual child identifies a set of safe people. We call them attachment people. And that this safe person is your go-to person. So when you are scared or exploring, you check and you make sure that that person is there, right? And if you have a good relationship with anybody, right? So it doesn't just have to be mom, but having one secure attachment relationship is protective. Having more is great, but having just one is critical. And so then we have other patterns. So we have an avoidant pattern. So these are people that don't use anybody for help, but they also don't look distressed. So be thoughtful about that. Resistant babies are the ones that are always upset. So any separation is very traumatic for them. They don't calm down when mom is there. They are continuing distressed, although they want to be near mom. And disorganized have no clear pattern. And so in the Romanian orphanage, we see a lot more of these. But even in typical populations, there's about a 10 to 15%. In terms of bubble wrap, this is looking at the change in that cellular mark of aging as a function of attachment classification. And what we see is we stabilize aging. So B is secure. And then this isn't actually going up, but our avoidant kids kind of look lower. But for our resistant and our disorganized kids, there's a rapid decline in telomere length. So this idea that having a secure attachment relationship not only will influence your autonomic nervous system, so Ruth Feldman has great data on that, but it may protect your cellular aging, and if this happens, it will also decrease your risk of those other disorders that are associated with ACEs, like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and hypertension. So, take-home points. Trauma affects the brain, the cells, the underlying neural circuitry. It will also influence the developmental tempo, and caregiving may be the ultimate bubble wrap. And then this is just the model that we use. So adverse experiences, caregiving buffers. The changes in the stress response system leads to changes in neural development, leads to altered behavioral, physiologic, cognitive, and health outcomes. That was a lot.
We have time for a few questions, and then we'll continue informally. So, Stacy, first of all, thank you. This is a lot of science in a very short space of time, and you made it as clear as a human being can. I think a lot of us learned a lot here. In terms of thinking about refugees, child refugees in particular, first of all, you make the case for the huge range of brain development changes that happen as the result of overwhelming disruption and threat and violence and lack of maternal buffering and all of that. If reporters are looking at, let's say, refugee camps or situations in which refugees are being resettled, it sounds like from a brain science perspective, sort of the three questions to ask in assessing whether things are going well might be, first of all, are children safe? Because without baseline safety, brain development is going to continue to be disrupted. Secondly, are buffers being created and encouraged, whether they are parental buffers or other secure attachments and predictability, and is buffering being created? And is there some integration of mental health and physiological needs? And would you say those are three biological takeaways for looking at refugee situations? I may be getting this all wrong, right? So
No, I think that's good. I think the idea of creating safe spaces, so you're not going to be able to have 100% safety, right? So none of these places are always going to be safe. But having time periods that are predictable, having a place that is a safe place, I think the idea of helping not just the sort of aid workers or the people doing the intervention understand what's driving these behaviors in kids, but also helping parents understand. So things like understanding that aggression is not your child's just a mean, bad child, but your child's fear system has been hyperactivated. They're not doing poorly in school because they're dumb or because they're mad at you and they want to prove to you that they aren't going to do well. They're doing it because they're having problems with attention. And I think the other part of it is to encourage people to believe that small, positive experiences, any of those can be helpful. I think sometimes the idea is that it's overwhelming, and if I can't get them into a perfect place or a safe home, then they're going to be at risk forever.
Yeah.
But small pieces, even 5-minute time periods of just focused play or responsiveness or interactions can be very protective.
And I just wanted to go back to something that you mentioned, but I think maybe worth emphasizing, at least as I understood it, as I understood the results of the Romanian study, one of the things you learned is that interventions do matter, that it is possible to alter this biochemical, neurochemical trajectory through adding stability and caregiving and so on, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, back to your point, not every kid is going to struggle. Kids' ability to get what they need from environments differ. Their sort of biologic temperament differs. We didn't talk about it, but there are huge sex differences in most of this. I think there are probably cultural, I'm sure there are cultural differences. So understanding the sort of ability to create cultural norms or understanding what the behaviors are is critical. How kids are expected to interact with other kids or adults varies. But I think understanding that is really important in terms of anything we do. And this is also, I cannot emphasize this enough. Data is really, really important. I worry a lot that people put interventions in place because they have worked in some situations, but that doesn't mean that they are going to work in all situations. And so anytime we think about doing interventions with highly vulnerable populations, the idea of being very culturally aware and collecting data is absolutely critical, because you may make an assumption that something is good, but we could be doing something very not good. And an example of this is that attention bias. So there was a study that was done thinking that all kids with anxiety had an attention bias toward threat. And so they did an exposure work where they taught the kids to disengage from threat, and a substantial portion of the kids got worse because the neurobiology underlying their anxiety was the opposite.
So that leads me to ask one more last question, then we'll go to the room. And it's a question that actually was asked in the first session this morning, but I think you came in after it. A lot of the reporters who are here who spend time with refugee children, whether Syrian refugee children or in the US or elsewhere, often witness troubling, disturbing play among kids. How do you as a clinician understand that and think about it? Is it part of a regulatory mechanism? Is it bad? Is it how do you think about it? Because there was a question how we as reporters should kind of understand and assess that.
So traumatic play, and there was somebody who had a child who was talking about their child being aggressive. So a couple of developmental things. First, does anyone know what age has the highest aggression? 4. Close. It's 2. So for all of you who had kids that bit other children before preschool, so 2-year-olds are neurobiologically going to be the most aggressive. Okay? When we see repetitive plays, it's the same thing over and over again, that is a sign of trauma. That is a symptom of trauma. And it's also something that if they keep doing isn't necessarily bad or good. And from a clinical standpoint, I use it as a sign of whether or not treatment's working. So as we do more evidence-based therapy, we expect to expand what is happening in that traumatic play, or to create different patterns of what is happening. But if a kid does the same thing over and over again, it's not making anything worse or better. It is their way of expressing their emotions. I think a lot of times parents will try to stop it, like, don't do that. And then you're triggering a fear response and the parents are terrified. What I tell parents is that this is a sign that your child's upset, and they're distressed and that they need comfort. You don't need to take the child's toy away that they're doing, but you might want to just hold them and sit with them.
And it doesn't mean that this is a future psycho killer in front of you.
No, it absolutely does not mean that.
Yeah.
We don't know what causes psychopathy or cold and callous conduct disorder. There are a subset of kids that are highly traumatized that become callous, unemotional, and conduct disorder.
Yeah.
But again, that's not always a direct path.
Yeah. Okay. So, Annalise.
I thought it was very interesting when you were talking about the notion of trauma and what is scary, the concept of what is scary, because your body adapts and you change depending on the circumstance. And I thought that is very helpful for us and very important, because when you're interviewing, for example, just as your student doctor went in and asked if that kid had experienced something traumatic and the kid said no or scary, in terms of asking basic questions. And I was wondering if in the medicine world there is any literature available in terms of what kind of interviewing techniques you use when approaching a child, because sometimes what do you ask that kid? How do you go into that child's head to understand what she or he experienced? Because I find that some kids are very open and eloquent and they can express themselves well, and even if you ask a basic question they will, but then sometimes it's harder to get a chance to, even sometimes for us it's really hard to actually get a chance to exchange with children. Sometimes the NGOs will be very protective and won't let us approach the children. Some other times they will actually allow for that to happen, but then obviously some of us, when I work with Syrian refugees, I have the barrier of the language, so I depend on a translator, and then for you to make sure that the translator is using the form that you want to get. So my question is there any literature available in terms of how to get into that child's head?
So first, I'm going to focus this on little kids because it's a very different sort of experience when you're dealing with adolescents. So just to be very clear about that. So first of all, it kind of depends on your goal. So from a clinical interview standpoint, if I am trying to get at what a child's trauma exposures have been, then I ask, and I'll often use pictures. So there's a set of cartoons called the Daryl cartoons that I think are publicly available.
Don't know. How do you spell
They're
it?
Dayy or Daryl. I'll see if I can get them for you. Daryl.
We can circulate.
I'll get them to you. So I will use pictures. My gut feeling is we would want to really create a different set of pictures and ask them if this has ever happened to them. The Daryl cartoons actually get at Ptsd symptoms, so they have a picture of a kid having a nightmare, so it's that little cloud thing above their head, or sitting in a different, like in a classroom and having pictures of things, so it gets at re-experiencing. It shows a child being very scared, standing by a stop sign, remembering a picture of a car accident. So using pictures, there's actually another one that I can send around too, to do that, to gather information about exposure. Has this ever happened to you? Is a really good way to do that. Kids can't express what they feel. So oftentimes I'll say, what thoughts are in your head? The question I ask at the end of every interview is, what are your 3 wishes? And I think that's a very powerful tool because it gives you insight into their thought process about future orientation, or what they want or what they need. In reading sort of the descriptions of some of the narrative pieces that I have seen, kids have goals of like wanting school, right? So it may be that they want a Matchbox car, and that's actually like a wish you could fulfill, right? So I think getting at those kind of things are really important. Oftentimes I ask them, what do you think your parents think about most, or any caregiver or whoever, if they have someone around them. Little kids are very good at projecting or stuff like that. So they'll, there's a Berkeley puppet interview is another thing. So you can use puppets to describe events. So if you have a puppet, like a bear puppet, and you say, oh, the bear heard the bombing, how do you think the bear is feeling? Or how many times do you think the bear has heard bombing? Are often interview techniques.
We can think about that and maybe talk informally over lunch about it. So let's do two last questions, ask them together, and so You two, go, and then take them together, and then we'll answer them
Okay.
together, and be condensed because we've got to get to lunch.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. My question about considering PSTD victims and the possibility of experiencing memory distortion and false memory formation. How, as a journalist, can I rely on information given by the victims?
I'll
Translate.
Yeah.
And the second one is it safe for a child to be interviewed in the first moment, or is it a type of re-experiencing or exposing to the event?
Okay, yeah, so how do we assess the veracity of memory versus false memory in children? Is it okay for children to be interviewed in the first place, or is that forcing re-experiencing on them? Then, Rosie, did you have something?
Yeah, it was more specifically looking back at when you were talking about how a child will identify a safe person, and if that safe person is absent because they've died or the child has been displaced separately, is it possible to recreate that in someone from the community or an NGO worker generally?
Okay, we'll make those the two. Those will have to be the two last questions, but then we can continue over lunch. Anyway, so go.
So briefly, so the loss of an attachment person is a big loss, okay? So that's very important. It is possible to develop other attachment relationships. Again, earlier is better. There is a limited number. Do we know what that is? No. But certainly the idea that the loss of an attachment person is a huge loss, but the ability to establish is not wiped out entirely. So it's possible to repair that. So in terms of false memories, kids' memories of traumatic exposure, and again, I'm focusing this on under 6 because other ages are different, they are not going to remember things necessarily temporally, so their sense of time is terrible. That's why you can tell them to wait 2 minutes and be either 20 minutes or 30 seconds. So there is no sense of time. Their temporal organization has not developed yet. And kids will integrate scary things, so they will be afraid of monsters, spiders, all of those things. That's how they may report it. And they may develop new fears or have regression, but they may not be able to tell you why. And that's really because the process of how their brain understands what has happened is different. Trauma memories in older children, so probably maybe starting around 3 or 4, are very different than narrative memories. And this is actually, if I were to put you in a scanner, we can look at this. So for those of you who have ever been to a cocktail party, right? Okay, and you tell people about that party later, there's a lot of fluidness in how you describe what people were doing or what was said. Trauma memories for, and I would again limit this probably 4 and up, maybe 3-year-olds do this, are concrete and exactly the same, and they don't change. They won't be temporally linked to anything, and they may have more sort of weird descriptions of things, but they are 100% the same over and over again. So an example of this is I did an evaluation of a girl who had been maltreated, placed in a new adoptive home, went to her daycare when she was 3, and the daycare worker picked her up by the arm and smashed her to the ground. I interviewed her 3 years later, and she's now 6, and she can describe the event exactly the same way. She can tell me what she was wearing. She knows exactly what position her arm was in. She can point to the tooth and the part of her lip, and it's exactly the same. So trauma memories don't change. But we do have, in the early years, kids will also, their symptoms will include sort of magical things or not real things as well. But specific traumatic exposures will be very non-changing.
And we will have some time to talk tomorrow about these questions of verification and accuracy. Like there are big ethical and practice questions in all of this. So here's what we're going to do. First of all, we are going to thank Stacy. I also want to thank the whole translation team for this session, which I know this was a very demanding one on them. We shall break for lunch. You should, we're set up upstairs, and you should find a table with one of this morning's speakers. This morning's speakers and our other various experts and funders will be distributed around the room. You know, sit at a table with them and talk. And when we come back this afternoon, a little later in the day, after the next round of panel, we will be breaking into small groups with today's speakers. So there'll be opportunity then to continue the conversation. Okay. I know there was a lot here. This is just going to kind of sit in the back of your brain, and we will keep processing it. Okay. Thanks.